Humanity will not be saved one day. It will only choose extinction because it has become aware of suffering. Most people can accept that individual life is painful. They experience it every day in small, quiet ways. In the exhaustion that never fully disappears. In relationships that demand more than they give. In the constant feeling that something is wrong, even when everything seems fine. What humans struggle to accept is something far more disturbing. That this suffering might not be an accident, not a temporary phase, not a problem waiting for a solution, but a structural feature of existence itself. Eduard von Hartmann did not deny human suffering. He began with it. He accepted that conscious life, as we experience it, carries more pain than pleasure, more frustration than fulfillment, more longing than satisfaction. But unlike many pessimists, Hartmann did not stop at the individual. He shifted the question. If individual happiness is mostly an illusion, if personal salvation keeps failing again and again, then perhaps meaning lies not in the individual, but in humanity as a whole. This is where his thought becomes dangerous. Hartmann proposed that humanity would one day reach full awareness of its condition, that consciousness, evolving through history, science, and reflection, would eventually recognize a simple truth. Existence is not worth continuing, not because of despair, not because of anger, but because of clarity. In his vision, humanity does not collapse into chaos or self-destruction. Instead, it arrives at a collective decision, a calm, rational agreement that non-existence is preferable to endless conscious suffering, a final act carried out not by individuals, but by the species itself. At first glance, this sounds like hope. A strange kind of hope, but hope nonetheless. Not salvation through heaven, progress, or enlightenment, but salvation through an ending. A future where suffering no longer needs to be endured because there is no one left to endure it. But Hartmann was not offering comfort, because even this idea, even this ultimate resolution, is not what it appears to be. He understood something deeply unsettling, that postponing the end can feel like purpose, that believing humanity will one day choose extinction allows individuals to keep living today without facing the full weight of meaninglessness. Collective salvation becomes a psychological delay mechanism, not a solution, but a postponement. Not hope, but a story that makes waiting tolerable. Hartmann's pessimism cuts precisely here. He argues that humans do not cling to life because it is good, but because letting go requires a level of honesty most are not ready for. This is why he famously wrote, "Happiness is a statistical error. Moments of pleasure exist, yes, but when measured against the totality of conscious experience, they are exceptions, not the rule. Outliers that distort perception just enough to keep the system running. The promise that humanity will one day end suffering together functions the same way. It allows individuals to endure their own lives while believing the pain is part of a larger, meaningful trajectory. But what if that trajectory is just another illusion? What if even the idea of collective extinction is not liberation, but the last narrative humans invent to avoid admitting that existence never needed justification in the first place?" Hartmann does not scream this conclusion. He lets it emerge slowly, uncomfortably, inevitably. And this raises a question most philosophies avoid. If suffering is real, if happiness is statistically insignificant, and if even humanity's final solution is just delayed acceptance, then what exactly are we hoping for when we keep going? There is a reason Eduard von Hartmann placed humanity's final decision in the distant future. Not because it requires time to be technically possible, but because psychologically, humans are incapable of accepting it now. Immediate truth is unbearable. Delayed truth feels manageable. Hartmann understood that human beings do not reject pessimism because it is false, but because it is premature. To fully accept that existence itself is a mistake would require a level of consciousness that most minds cannot sustain without collapsing. So humanity compromises. Instead of admitting that life has no redeeming balance, it invents narratives that stretch meaning across time. Progress, historical destiny, future awakening, collective resolution. These ideas function as emotional buffers. They allow individuals to live inside suffering while believing it serves a larger, invisible purpose. Hartmann's collective extinction is often misunderstood as radical despair. In reality, it is a psychological anesthetic, a promise that says, "You don't need to face this now." And humans are remarkably skilled at accepting anything as long as it doesn't demand immediate honesty. This is why civilizations endure. Not because they are happy, but because they are distracted by futures that never arrive. Every generation inherits the same burden, but reframes it as temporary. Your pain is not meaningless, it contributes. Your exhaustion is not final, it is transitional. Your suffering is not pointless, it is moving towards something. Hartmann saw through this mechanism. He recognized that when suffering becomes unbearable, humans do not abandon existence. They reorganize hope. Religion promised heaven after death. Enlightenment promised reason and progress. Modernity promised technology and comfort. Hartmann's era promised collective resolution. Different languages, same function. All of them delay confrontation with a simple fact. No future state can retroactively justify lived suffering. This is where Hartmann diverges from optimistic philosophies. They argue that suffering is redeemed by outcomes. He argues that outcomes arrive too late to redeem anything. A pain endured does not become meaningful because it was followed by understanding. A life spent struggling does not become justified because history advanced. Meaning that arrives after suffering is not meaning. It is reinterpretation. And reinterpretation is one of humanity's most refined survival tools. Hartmann's pessimism is not loud. It is methodical. He does not say humans should end existence immediately. He says humans will only choose truth when they have exhausted every illusion. That is why collective extinction must wait. Not because it is ethically complex, but because humans still believe there might be another story worth trying. As long as even one narrative remains unexplored, hope survives. And as long as hope survives, truth remains postponed. Hartmann believed humanity was moving toward awareness, but not toward courage. Knowledge increases. Suffering remains. Only the explanations change. This is the uncomfortable implication of his philosophy. Humanity does not evolve toward happiness, but toward more sophisticated ways of enduring unhappiness. And endurance is not the same as redemption. Eduard von Hartmann did not deny that moments of pleasure exist. What he denied was their philosophical weight. For him, happiness was never proof of life's value, only a numerical anomaly within a structure overwhelmingly defined by dissatisfaction, effort, and loss. When he called happiness a statistical error, he was not speaking poetically. He meant it literally. If one were to honestly measure the totality of conscious experience across a lifetime, pleasure would appear as an exception rather than a rule, a deviation from the dominant pattern rather than its confirmation. Human beings remember happiness vividly, but live dissatisfaction continuously. This asymmetry is not accidental. Pleasure is sharp, brief, and memorable precisely because it is rare, while suffering is dull, repetitive, and therefore normalized. Hartmann understood that humans do not evaluate life rationally. They evaluate it selectively. Moments of relief are overemphasized, while prolonged discomfort is treated as background noise, something to be endured rather than questioned. This is how the illusion sustains itself. A person does not say, "My life is mostly tolerable with intermittent pain." They say, "I have had happy moments." And those moments are used retroactively to justify everything that surrounds them. Hartmann rejected this logic. For him, happiness that merely interrupts suffering does not redeem it. A break in pain is not the same as the absence of pain, and relief does not transform the condition it temporarily suspends. This is why happiness functions ideologically. It does not describe reality, it reframes it. It tells the individual that enduring life is worthwhile because there are occasional rewards, without questioning whether the cost itself is justified. From Hartmann's perspective, Happiness is not evidence in favor of existence. It is a coping mechanism produced by it. Civilizations are built around this misunderstanding. Entire economic systems promise happiness as an outcome, not as a state. Work now, enjoy later. Sacrifice youth, gain security. Endure the present, redeem the future. But the future never stabilizes into fulfillment. It simply becomes the present again, with the same structure of effort and dissatisfaction, dressed in slightly different conditions. Hartmann saw this repetition clearly. Progress does not eliminate suffering, it redistributes it. Comfort does not remove dissatisfaction, it refines it. The absence of physical pain often amplifies psychological emptiness. This is why modern happiness appears increasingly fragile. The more life is optimized for comfort, the more intolerable its underlying meaninglessness becomes. If happiness were natural to existence, it would not need to be pursued, measured, marketed, or defended. The very obsession with happiness is evidence of its instability. Hartmann's pessimism does not ask why people are unhappy. It asks why they expect to be happy at all. From his standpoint, consciousness itself is misaligned with satisfaction. Desire constantly outpaces fulfillment, and awareness magnifies lack more effectively than contentment. Even when happiness occurs, it arrives already shadowed by its disappearance. It is experienced alongside the knowledge that it will not last. This knowledge is not incidental, it is central. Thus, happiness becomes self-defeating. The very consciousness that allows us to recognize it also ensures that we cannot rest within it. This is why Hartmann believed that humanity's final disillusionment would not come from despair, but from clarity. Not from an excess of suffering, but from the realization that even happiness fails to deliver what it promises. When happiness is exposed as statistically insignificant, the question shifts. Not, how do we maximize it? But why are we organizing existence around an exception? And once that question is asked sincerely, the logic of collective endurance begins to unravel. Eduard von Hartmann accepted something most philosophies resist admitting: that individual existence is structurally bound to suffering. But unlike Schopenhauer, he did not believe that salvation could be achieved through individual withdrawal, asceticism, or personal enlightenment. For Hartmann, the individual could never escape alone, because the individual was never the source of the problem. The problem was consciousness itself. To exist as a conscious being is to desire, to lack, to anticipate, and to remember. And every one of these functions generates dissatisfaction, not accidentally, but necessarily. Hartmann's originality lies in what he did next. Instead of imagining a heroic individual overcoming existence, he imagined humanity slowly realizing something unbearable together. Not that life is difficult, not that life is unfair, but that life, even at its best, does not justify itself. This is where the idea of collective redemption enters his philosophy, not as hope, but as diagnosis. Hartmann did not believe humanity would suddenly decide to disappear. There is no romantic apocalypse in his system, no dramatic final gesture. What he envisioned was far colder and far slower, a gradual accumulation of awareness. As suffering becomes better understood, better measured, and less mystified, the justifications for existence begin to erode. Not emotionally, but intellectually. At first, humanity tries to fix the problem. It improves living conditions, expands rights, refines ethics, advances science. And Hartmann welcomed these efforts. Reducing suffering is not meaningless to him. It is simply insufficient. Because no matter how much suffering is reduced, the structure remains intact. Desire persists. Loss persists. Fear of death persists. The exhaustion of maintaining oneself persists. Progress, in this sense, sharpens the problem instead of solving it. When survival is no longer the primary struggle, meaning becomes the battlefield. And meaning does not emerge automatically from comfort. Hartmann believed that, over time, humanity would begin to see through its own narratives. Religion would lose its authority. not because it was attacked, but because it would no longer convince. National myths would weaken, not through rebellion, but through exhaustion. The promise that the future will redeem the present would slowly collapse under its own repetition. This is what he meant by collective insight. Not agreement, not unity, but convergence. Different cultures, different systems, different beliefs arriving independently at the same conclusion. That consciousness is a burden that no historical improvement can fully relieve. And yet, even here, Hartmann refused consolation. Because even if humanity were to reach this awareness, even if it collectively recognized that non-existence would be preferable to existence, this recognition itself would not be a form of hope. Why? Because awareness does not undo biology. Life continues to reproduce itself instinctively, mechanically, without consulting philosophy. The will does not dissolve simply because it is understood. This is why Hartmann's vision is often misunderstood as optimistic. It is not. The idea that humanity might one day choose non-being is not presented as salvation, but as the final stage of disillusionment. Even then, suffering does not vanish. It only stops being justified. Collective redemption in Hartmann's system is not a triumph. It is an admission that all previous meanings were provisional, that happiness was overstated, that progress was misinterpreted, that hope functioned more as anesthesia than truth. In this sense, collective extinction is not a goal to be pursued, but a conclusion waiting at the end of honesty. Hartmann understood something deeply unsettling, that humanity's greatest fear is not annihilation, but the realization that nothing was ever owed to it in the first place. This is why he could say, without irony, that even the end of consciousness would not be a victory. It would simply be the end of the error. Hartmann did not believe that becoming aware of suffering would make life meaningful. He believed the opposite. The more clearly suffering is understood, the less convincing existence becomes. Awareness does not function like light in a dark room. It does not reveal a hidden order. It reveals that there was never an order to begin with. This is the fundamental mistake of optimism, the assumption that knowledge heals. Hartmann saw knowledge as corrosive. It eats away at illusions faster than it builds replacements. As consciousness develops, it does not grow stronger, it grows heavier. Every new layer of understanding adds responsibility, memory, and anticipation. The organism does not simply live anymore. It must now justify itself to itself. This is why highly conscious societies do not become happier. They become more medicated, more distracted, more restless. When survival is secured, anxiety does not disappear. It multiplies. Hartmann understood this long before modern psychology gave it a name. He saw that consciousness produces a surplus of suffering that no material progress can absorb. Pleasure can momentarily distract, but it cannot settle the account. This is where his most brutal insight emerges. Happiness is not rare by accident. It is rare by structure. When Hartmann said, "Happiness is a statistical error," he was not being poetic. He meant that happiness appears only as an exception within a system designed for dissatisfaction. Desire is endless. Satisfaction is temporary. Loss is guaranteed. If happiness were the goal of existence, existence would be catastrophically inefficient at achieving it. And yet, humanity keeps insisting that it will figure it out eventually. That the next reform, the next technology, the next social arrangement will finally tip the balance. Hartmann saw this as a psychological defense, not a rational expectation. Hope, in this sense, is not courage. It is postponement. We delay the conclusion because facing it all at once would be unbearable. So history becomes a long negotiation with reality. Not yet, not yet, not yet. But the negotiation never changes the terms. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Hartmann's philosophy is its moral dimension. He was not indifferent to suffering. He did not advocate cruelty or neglect. On the contrary, he believed that reducing suffering was ethically mandatory, but not because it would save existence. because it would soften the weight of a mistake that could not be undone. This is a crucial distinction. For Hartmann, compassion does not redeem life. It makes life less violent while it lasts. He supported ethical progress, social responsibility, and collective care not as steps toward happiness, but as damage control. There is something brutally honest in this position. It removes the romance from morality. You do not help others because it will make the world meaningful. You help because suffering does not need additional justification to be wrong. This is where Hartmann quietly dismantles heroic ethics. There is no noble struggle against existence. There is only the refusal to add unnecessary pain. And yet, even this ethics contains no promise. It does not aim at fulfillment. It aims at reduction. Less pain, less illusion, less repetition. That is all. Hartmann did not imagine humanity ending in fire or collapse. No cosmic judgment, no final revelation. The end, if it ever arrives, would be anticlimactic, quiet, administrative. Birth rates decline, desires weaken, ambitions shrink. The future loses its emotional gravity. Not despair, but fatigue. The world does not explode. It simply loses the energy to continue convincing itself. This is why Hartmann's philosophy feels unsettling. There is no tragedy in it, no heroism, no catharsis, only the slow erosion of reasons. Existence does not end because it is hated. It ends because it is no longer believed in. Hartmann forces us into a position most philosophies avoid. He does not ask, "How should we live?" He asks, "Why are we so desperate to justify living?" This is the question that destabilizes everything, because once it is asked honestly, the usual answers sound rehearsed. Career, legacy, love, progress, purpose. None of them fail completely, but none of them succeed absolutely either. They function, they distract, they sustain, but they do not resolve. Hartmann did not offer despair as an answer. He offered clarity. And clarity, once seen, does not comfort. It removes the illusion that comfort was ever the point. Eduard von Hartmann does not end with despair, but neither does he end with hope. What he leaves us with is something far more unsettling. A vision of humanity slowly arriving at the same conclusion, not through wisdom, but through exhaustion. Individual life, he admits, is saturated with suffering. This is not a controversial claim for a pessimist. The rupture comes later, when he suggests that even collective survival is not sacred, only habitual. Humanity continues not because life is good, but because ending it requires a clarity we have not yet reached. The idea of collective redemption is often misunderstood as a final solution, a dark utopia where suffering is resolved. Hartmann saw it differently. He did not imagine humanity courageously choosing non-existence as an act of liberation. He imagined it stumbling there reluctantly, dragged by history, disappointment, and the slow erosion of illusion. What looks like purpose is, in his view, merely delayed resignation. What looks like progress is the gradual admission that happiness never arrived in the numbers we were promised. When Hartmann writes that happiness is a statistical error, he is not denying joy altogether. He is stripping it of authority. Pleasure exists, but it never accumulates. It never outweighs the structure that produces pain. It appears randomly, briefly, unevenly, and then disappears, leaving the system intact. To build a philosophy of life around such exceptions, Hartmann believed, was not optimism, but self-deception refined into doctrine. There is no triumph in his vision of the end, no cleansing fire, no moral resolution. If humanity ever abandons existence, it will not be because it has finally understood the universe, but because it has finally stopped expecting it to justify itself. The illusion will not collapse all at once. It will thin out, generation by generation, until continuation no longer feels necessary. Hartmann does not ask us to act. He does not demand belief. He does not call for sacrifice. His philosophy does not persuade. It waits. It assumes that if consciousness continues long enough, it will eventually confront the arithmetic it has been avoiding. And when it does, there will be no revelation, only recognition. This is not a philosophy of salvation. It is a philosophy of delayed acceptance, and it ends exactly where it must, without reassurance, without redemption, and without pretending that endurance itself is a virtue.